regulations. So that was the whole plan. We're going to set a cap on how much we can emit, and we're going to have people trade offsets. It's a little bit different than what we're talking about right now. The reason being, and I want to make sure that people understand that when right now we're not setting a cap. We don't even have, but we only have the regulated markets only in California right now. So everything else is voluntary. And while it's set up differently, I think the results, and Tom would probably agree with me, the results would be the same. If you set up and you say you're going to cap emissions at this much, and we're going to charge emitters, and they're going to have to offset these emissions by buying carbon credits, that's different than voluntary that says, hey, I'm Pepsi and I want to become net carbon zero by 2050 or 20 whatever. They're different, but at the same time, they're very similar, because does anybody think Pepsi is not going to increase past those costs for buying these credits along the process? That's where Tom and I would probably, as economists, would probably say, hey, cap and trade is different than this voluntary thing, but in concept, but in practice, you're going to have these companies, by and large, are going to pass on these additional costs as they're willing to take. And so it becomes very interesting. Here's a map that I want. This is not a slight to the western part of the United States, but this is the Chicago Climate Exchange, which was the active voluntary exchange back during the Obama administration. Very active, had 40 million acres signed up at one point. This is their map of how much carbon you could sequester in soils across mostly the central to eastern part of the United States. So as you can see, the western part of the United States doesn't have much at all. Didn't really have them in the map. And so that tells you what people thought back then about how much carbon is going to be offset in your area. And I think it has something to say about now. The results of our deal said basically the cost of business practices increasing was going to be more than the return that a producer was going to get from the credits, and so it failed. I should say that the analysis came out. It caused a big stink. It wasn't good for agriculture, but the most important thing that sidelined cap and trade back in 2009 was a midterm election where the Republicans took back control of the House of Representatives, which is exactly the situation people are talking about right now. Whether that comes true or not, I can't tell you, but I can tell you that there's a lot of folks that have kind of hit the brakes on moving really fast forward on climate change, because they think that the administration is not going to be able to get very much of that agenda done before this midterm election. That's just something to think about. A number of people probably know greenhouse gas stuff better than I do, but basically CO2 is by and large our largest source of emissions, followed by nitrous oxide and methane, pretty close, which is different than agriculture. So as carbon dioxide from cars is a big deal. In agriculture, our sources are a little bit different. When you look at the U.S. relative to the rest of the world, China is the biggest emitter. We're about half of them, and then other major players. But when countries get together and start talking about doing good things for the environment, it needs to include China if we're going to get very far. So ag sources of greenhouse gases, the number one source is nitrogen loss from what they call ag soil management, but basically it's nitrogen loss. Then you got the enteric fermentation, which is whether you want to be crude and say cow farts, or whether you want to be tactful, Tom, and say belches. I don't know, but that's the number two source of greenhouse gases from ag. Then manure management for like dairy lagoons. You can read the list, but there's other things that are small in comparison to Ag soil management. This is what I wanted to show you. You know, that chart that EPA put together, that bar would go out way far to the right, meaning that nitrogen loss is way the biggest ag source, and we're about 9.6 or 10% if you want to round of all the U.S. Greenhouse gas emissions comes from ag. Uh, so when people start talking about how are you going to uh, manage greenhouse gases with carbon credits and carbon bank and things like that, agriculture needs to do a better job of keeping the nitrogen from leaching out of the soil um, first. There's some graphs here that anybody could have, but essentially it came out of the EPA's latest assessment. You can see where ag is ag is a player in the fossil fuel combustion, but you know, down lower you got urea fertilization, liming, that's ag things. Uh, Ag is a huge source of methane from enteric fermentation, manure management, rice, the rice cultivation, things like that. Nitrous oxide, obviously, big deal there. And then there's some fluorocarbon things that I don't know very much about and don't really pertain to agriculture. So let's talk about, you know, in terms of the Biden administration's plans. You know, uh, they had a presidential uh, uh, focus early on where carbon bank and climate smart practices were two of the things that were talked about the most. I understand the concept of the carbon bank, and there was some discussion of whether USDA was going to be that bank. That has kind of fallen off since. Climate smart practices is the one that kind of makes me giggle to myself as a policy person, because they announced climate smart practices, but they never really said what they were going to define them as initially. That over time that has happened. But one of the things that really has taken place is I've been doing this stuff for over 30 years, and soil health is kind of built over the last 10 years, have gotten kind of more and more foothold in terms of, hey, we need to do things about soil health. But in my mind, they've kind of renamed themselves regenerative agriculture, and they've plugged into this climate smart practices. So if you think of climate smart practices, you really need to think at the same time regenerative ag. What am I talking about? I'm talking about no-till, I'm talking about cover crops, things like that. And there have been some hearings. If you want to go back and read or listen to them, there's been a request for comments from the chief economist on what people should do. If you want to hear me get really, really blunt about how all this is probably going to work, you could click on this podcast thing here at the bottom at some point, and me, along with a couple of other ag economists from around the country, talk about this stuff. One of the things that people like myself do when we get a new administration in is we want to see what their transition team is going to do. And the transition team for the Biden administration put together something called the Climate 21 Project. And that you can see the key program recommendations there. But essentially, the person who wrote that is Robert Bonney, who has also been, he was part of the Obama administration on climate change back 10 plus years ago. He has now been nominated, he hasn't been confirmed yet, to be the Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation. So he would be in the driver's seat, in a position to make some programmatic changes to how USDA is going to function. Anyhow, he's the one that wrote these recommendations, and they've basically followed him. He did. President Biden issued a presidential order saying we were going to do these climate practices, so we're moving down that way. But when that happened back in January, February timeframe to where we are sitting in June, there hasn't been much happening since that time. And so recently there was an announcement about USDA is going to invest $10 million, which in the world of agriculture, $10 million sounds like a lot to me and you, but it's not very much in terms of doing any kind of programmatic work in ag. To do a pilot on 10 states None of them in the West. I don't think you would call Montana. I guess Montana is the West. Sorry, I misspoke. Um, so, but most of it is on using EQIP funding to do practices building soil health. It's got to be a lot of what Midwest agriculture looking stuff. Um, and the claim was that they were going to use what they learned in this to go nationwide really soon, and we'll see, because it takes a long time to host a sign up. I don't know what they're going to have learned so they can go nationwide within a year, but that's kind of where we're at on that. There are a number of different what I call ag companies, but they're really in the world of carbon. They're called project developers, and the project developers are the folks who are going around trying to sign people up to have them do practices that they can generate with a third party, generally a third party verifier. So um, this is where I kind of stop and say, here we go. Use Pepsi as an example. Use American Airlines. It doesn't matter. Pretty much every big company in this country has come out with a carbon pledge, and that is to be kept carbon neutral by X. And you're running planes all over the world. You're not going to not have emissions. So how are you going to do this? You're going to buy credits, and you know, right now there are people talking about the carbon credit market being $100 per credit per ton market. Um, I can tell you that when folks sign up with any of these firms on here, they're going to get somewhere between $10 and $20 for that ton of CO2 equivalent left in the soil. So there's a lot of people in between the producers in ag, or the landowners in ag, and the companies who want to do good things for the environment. And as is often the case, I think that you see the legislation that's moving through Washington right now that passed the Senate. It's basically to set up the rules of the game for how are we going to. Somebody has to determine what soil testing technique we're going to use to determine soil carbon. That is not an agreed upon thing. Everyone's going to use their own measurement, and until then, we've got to. The government's going to come in with a plan. At one point, it looked like the government was going to come in with the money, and that is not going to be the case. It's going to be with the rules of the game, I believe, is the way I would describe it. Independent verifiers, there's companies popping up saying, if you sell the carbon credit, we'll go make sure it's there so that the company that's paying for it gets what they want to pay for. This is a good time to say most companies, all but Bayer, want to sign up people who have not done these practices before. So Nevada is going to be a lot different than a lot of other places, where Nevada doesn't I have the data on it, and it shows that there's not a lot of no-till and not a lot of cover crops being done in Nevada. Makes sense. But if there was, and they wanted to sign up, only one company will sign you up if you are already done the practice. Everyone else wants brand new, hadn't been done before. We're going to start to finish verify everything that the carbon is in the soil. And that is a big deal. There's a term called additionality that is in this area. And additionality means that people only want to pay for new practices and carbon that hasn't already been through a different program. There have been EQIP programs and other USDA conservation programs that would not as the original measure of what they were intended to do, but they would actually, we have a lot of land in this country that will not be eligible for these programs because they are already in no-till or already in cover crops. And the question is, people keep saying, should we plow our land so that we can start over? And that seems like a huge waste. If there's carbon in the soil, there are people that need to make this decision in Washington that say, do we want to pay people to keep it in the soil not to put it there, but to keep it there. And those are discussions that are going to have to be made in Washington, because right now, many of the companies want to do new carbon credits versus what people would say, I've been doing these practices for a while. An example of what's an announcement that's out there with Corteva, obviously they're focused on the Midwest, $5 to $20 per acre, depending upon what practices they do. Is that going to move the needle with the producer? You tell me $5 an acre, but there's a whole lot of record keeping that has to be done, and I have to allow third-party verifiers on my operation whenever they want to come. Is it worth my $5? Is it worth $20? I can tell you that most of the world right now thinks it's $40 to $80 was what it's going to take to get a carbon market moving. Here's some literature on that was put together on how the different firms that differ. I'm not going to go through that, but essentially, as I'm telling producers that I do work with producers on this, and I tell them, you need to do your homework to make sure that the company you sign up with, how long is their agreement, what exactly are you going to get paid for, and what violates that agreement, because you could think you're going to go do good farming practices and you might violate your agreement. So you got to make sure. There's a lot of fine print. USDA NRCS has a listing of about, it's 33 protocols that exist to generate a carbon credit. And according to USDA, 22 of those 33 have never generated an offset or a credit. What does that mean? That means that they focus basically on the list that I have. The list went further down the page, but I only looked at the cover here, because the first 4, because those are the primary ones that people are using right now. And you can see on anaerobic digester, the dairy methane capture is a big deal. Well, let's focus on a little bit about what's going on in Nevada. Soil Health Institute, again, has been doing this for quite some time. They've grabbed the census data and looked at, how many acres are in different places in cover crops. And again, less than 25,000 acres in Nevada in cover crops. I'm not sure that surprises anybody. When you look at where those acres are at, I don't spend much time in Nevada other than Reno to ski and Vegas to gamble. But I do know there's some ag areas that have on east and west that have done some cover crops. Same thing about no-till acres. Somewhere between 10 and 100,000 acres of no-till. That sounds pretty good until you look at the data, and it's closer to 10 than 100,000. And most of that is west, a couple of counties in Nevada. But if you look at this graph, and no-till is the number one way to generate a carbon credit. And I tell you that none of those acres that was signed up that is doing no-till in 2017, very few of them are going to be eligible to generate a carbon credit. Does that show you that there's going to be a problem with folks around the country going, wait a minute, well, I'm going to go get the disc out and I'm going to dig it, I'm going to plow, and that's going to release whatever carbon was in the soil into the atmosphere. And what did you win? What did you get if that happens? That's the question that people need to think about. Here's Iowa as a benchmark for the Midwest, Nevada, and Texas, because I'm using this for something else later today. Cover crop acres, it's a big deal in Texas. And a lot of people say we can't do cover crops in Texas because we don't have enough water for the primary crop and this cover crop, but we're still using a lot of it in Texas. And then no-till acres. And there's a little bit of use in both in Nevada. So I can tell you, folks that are already doing this are not going to get paid for this unless they sign up with Bayer right now. They're the only ones that would pay you for practices you've already done. And I believe they go back as far as 2012. When you look at state rankings, Nevada is number 46 in terms of practices overall, but 26th in change. So I don't know what y'all have done, Tom, but you've made some changes and you're ranking 26th in terms of increase in cover crop type activities from 2012 census to 2017. Again, different type of land. It's just different. One thing I will point out is that while we have this entirely voluntary system where people can get paid for doing no-till or whatever, we have a lot of skepticism among our producers, at least back in April. This poll said that most people needed more information before they were going to sign up with anybody, which makes a lot of sense. So kind of where I'm at on this as of today is that, and this is something I don't know for a fact, but I just want to throw out there. There is a claim that is in the press that companies that want to become net carbon zero are paying upwards of $100 per ton. And I can tell you the average in the United States right now that a producer would receive is closer to $10 a ton. So somebody in the middle is making $90 a ton. And that is the reason why there's legislation going on in Washington to try to make sure that everyone gets treated the same, and that maybe the government could be help with the rules, as I would say. The second bullet is the most important bullet. Most of these people that I call brokers or the companies, they only want to sign up people who will begin to do no-till or begin to do cover crops now, so that those are, there's certain companies that are willing to pay more for what they can call the best carbon credits. I don't know what that's going to get you, but in that world, what about those people that have already done these practices for years? The concept of additionality is something that Washington will have to get to the bottom of, and make the idea basically to determine whether there's going to be, is carbon that's kept in the soil, that's been in the soil, is it worth paying to keep it in the soil? That's something somebody else is going to have to decide. And I'm very much on record as telling people that it's not the worst idea to let this play out. I thought that by the end of this summer, there would be more information out of Washington so that people would see kind of guidance. Because at one point, it looked like USDA was going to operate a carbon bank, which was going to be in competition to all these companies. Well, that isn't the case anymore. They're not going to compete with the companies, but they are going to lay out the ground rules. And I don't know what would happen if I went and signed up with a company today and sign this long-term agreement to sequester carbon for an amount of money, however much, and then the USDA comes in and changes it such that the rules are more defined and they can do more. So I'm going to end, and hopefully you'll have a couple of questions, and maybe I'll know a few answers. But if you have any questions, you want to get a copy of these slides, I'm going to send them to Tom. But you could email me directly or whatever you want to do. That's fine. And appreciate your attention.
Well, thank you, Joe. Yes, I also got this recorded. I missed your first two slides, but that's all right. The main thing is, Joe, yeah, talk about Robert Bonney, that USDA. What are they talking about public lands out here? Are they going to be any participant in this? I mean, we have range cattle out there. I guess we got to watch them.
I have done some checking, and obviously right now it doesn't look like they're going to be participants. But to me, if I am folks in the West, maybe I look at things a little bit weirder than most people do. But if I'm on federal lands and I'm running cows and I do practices that's going to be better for the environment, why shouldn't I get paid?
Yeah.
That is really the bottom line is, regardless of who owns that land, the folks with the grazing rights are, there will be people on the other side that say, well, we can fix this by just not allowing you to have as many.
Cows.
Yeah, but to me, we're in a voluntary world on this right now, which is the best way to be. And as long as we're in a voluntary world, why wouldn't we go to Washington, use our elected officials, and say, you know what? The Midwest is doing cover crops and they're doing no-till, and God bless them for that. They're going to do this. But that won't work where we're at. And if we're going to participate and try to uh, mitigate this greenhouse gases going into the environment, this is what the West can do. And why wouldn't we get paid for it? To me, it's common sense. You know,
Yeah.
I keep telling the folks in Texas, most of the state of Texas cannot do cover crops, and and they don't want to do no-till, or they already did no-till. They tried it and it didn't work for them for whatever reason, and so they're saying, well, my answer is no. You're being short-sighted. What you need to do is figure out practices that will reduce nitrogen loss, whatever, and let's go to Washington and see about getting you paid for them.
True.
And that's the way that I think people in the West should think about it.
One more question and open it up. Well, some of the practices in the Midwest, with those, and we use inputs from the Midwest, will those costs filter down to the Western producer maybe, if you're buying inputs from the Midwest?
You know, that's a good question, Tom. For everything I read about, no-till is beneficial to producers, and no-till is, just um, uh, let me stop sharing so you won't have to look at my ugly
Okay.
screen. Well, crap, I got it all scattered over now. Yeah, I can't find it. Yeah, that isn't gonna work. Anyway, can you see my screen now? This is reading.
Yeah, I can see you, and I see your carbon credit highlighted under there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the big deal is on the cost, the things that come out of the Midwest. If you read the literature put out by the people who want to say that this works really well, is that their costs are going to go down for producers. I don't have any information that says that at all, but that doesn't mean it's not true. It just means I don't have it.
I was going to say, I have one Boys Ranches. You like to ask a question to Joe, please?
Yes, this is Robin Boyce. I'm sorry I couldn't get my title changed up there. I've been involved with the Ecosystem Market Consortium group, and I was wondering if you had been in on any of those conversations, because everything you're bringing up, from additionality and incentivizing perverse practices to get back to a lower baseline, is just, I don't know, that's been an issue since I started learning about ecosystem service stuff 10, 15 years ago. And the other thing is, within that group, all the pilot projects are Midwest, Central, Northern Central Plains, Southern Plains. There is one pilot up in the Northwest that I'm involved with. But what's become very apparent is the need with that group and their metrics they're creating, and it's carbon and then water quality and quantity, is that in the Western rangelands, biodiversity is needed, and creating metrics for that, and perhaps a more holistic approach to putting a package together for those buyers, that it might be a little different market. I mean, are you involved with any of those discussions?
Well, okay, so I'm not sure if you were on at the very beginning, but our center that I help run has for 35 years done policy analysis for the Congress behind the scenes. And that's when he went through all the stuff about working with representative ranches and things. That's why we want to have that real life, real world, get out of the university and go and see the people and get the costs. And I can tell you that right now we have been asked to do some work on carbon by different members of the Ag Committees, House, Senate, Democrat, Republican, in different things. And not as many, most of it is on the business side, and it's not on the practical, how would you make this work better for our producers side, unfortunately. A lot of it is in the, hey, is there a trade advantage to being able to say we're the lowest carbon corn in the world? That type of thing. And but that's not to say we will not be involved in that going forward. And those efforts that you're talking about, that you're working on, are absolutely the types of things where you have to have real world people sitting in these rooms. I don't want to insult any politician, but they don't get out with real people that often. And they have to have real people go to Washington and tell them, this is how, I mean, this is fine on paper in Washington, but this is how it's going to work out here in Nevada. And unless that happens, we're not going to have policies that are going to be very effective across the West.
Well, if there's anyone who's interested in a pilot project here in Nevada, I've been trying to drum one up. So I'm very curious, and I'm curious if there's any data out there. There's a lot of native meadowland, never been tilled in Nevada. Is there a possibility there are these big legacy carbon sinks? So
yes.
those questions answered.
Absolutely. And that has been the agronomists tell me native prairie grasses where I'm from, and anything that has been in place for more than 30 years, you're not going to get more soil carbon in to stay. You're not going to get any more than is in there right now. So under no circumstances. So that is the question. The question is, are politicians willing to look at why shouldn't we pay people to make sure that stays undisturbed so that it stays where it's at? Because the folks who measure this stuff say you're not going to get any more soil carbon than some of these meadows and grasses, prairie grasses, where they've been undisturbed for a long period of time.
Good. Brandon, you like to ask? You asked a question. Would you like to ask that question? I see here. Now, Brandon's with the Nevada Department of Agriculture. How about the states? Joe, will the state's Department of Agriculture have anything when this, or is this just totally federal?
Well, at this point in time, be careful how I say this. At this point in time, the federal government really doesn't have much of a role either until this legislation gets passed that they're working on right now. I mean, most people have kind of attached themselves to the NRCS guidelines on what it takes to sequester coal, the practices, the 33 practices. But I don't know in terms of who's going to verify that what a company says is in the soil, and they have paid the farmer for the carbon credits that were generated, and some other larger company up the food chain has paid them money. It seems like state departments of agriculture or the federal government, one, is going to have to step in and make sure that the business practices are
legit.
Yeah.
Sure. Brandon, you got please, could you ask your question?
Yeah, one question I had was with the formulation, kind of the policy coming down the pipe, was there any interaction with some of the third-party markets that are out there that were kind of modeled off of California's early greenhouse gas structures?
There is a lot of interaction there. The guy that we mentioned earlier, Robert Bonney, knows more about this stuff than anybody in this country. And so people are trying to take lessons learned from the Chicago Climate Exchange that it was 10 years ago, and the much newer California plan. But At the same time, there's a balance there where producers, if you went and asked a producer about this, it doesn't matter where, they're going to say, you know what, I don't mind this being available, but make it voluntary, which is kind of hard to do all this nice things on a voluntary basis. If I was skeptical at all, I'd say that voluntary transitions to mandatory. But right now, I can't say that because that's all anybody said is that everything's voluntary. But believe me, everyone has looked. They don't want things to not work, so they have looked around at all the different technologies, all the different practices, all the different ways of doing this, and to date, the best thing they can say is, and this is what I keep coming back to on the legislation that's in Washington right now. What they say is we absolutely have to have a defined set of rules that people know what the rules are going to be. And the federal government has to do that. And that's what's in that legislation. There's the Climate Act, Climate Smart Act, or whatever it's called. That's basically all it is.
Doug, I see Doug Busselman heads up our Nevada Farm Bureau. You got a question?
Yes, thank you. I guess one of the questions that I have is what exactly is the Nevada College of Agriculture doing to work on the science side of how Western agriculture and practices are relevant in terms of how do we establish the necessary foundation that we need to understand to make those cases to our elected officials. I've had conversation with Senator Cortez Masto's office and as well as Senator Rosen's office. And one of the things that I've tried to promote is that everything is so Midwestern biased that we really don't have the foundation here in the West to know what exactly we need to do in terms of practices that are going to result in measurable improvements that would be part of a conversation in a reality of doing that. The other thing I think that's out there, we may have a bigger risk from climate regulations coming from the state and their efforts to engage, not through the Department of Agriculture, but through the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection and some of those things, as the Sisolak administration has run away with this idea that Nevada is going to be carbon free and greenhouse gas free by 2015 or 2050 or whatever it is. We may start feeling the heat more from state government than we will feds. Those, I guess, are comments and questions. And I think the discussion needs to focus on what are we going to do in Nevada in order to establish how the role of agriculture fits in Nevada's scheme.
I could only comment on where we fit, similar to what you just said. Earlier this year, I convened a meeting of pretty much all the ag representatives in Texas. Our college did, and I spoke to the group about, just like what you said, everything is Midwest centric, and do we want a role? And I had a number of producer organizations say, you know, this is going to be nothing but more red tape for us, or this and that, and we're not all that interested. And I said, well, just make sure you understand that today they're telling you it's voluntary. You might want to think about the longer run and trying to find practices that will work for whatever state you're in. And I'm in Texas, so we were worrying about Texas. And I would encourage y'all to be thinking through the process of, if your senator goes and says, the only way I'm voting for this legislation is that you've got to put something in here that allows folks in the West to participate, it's going to carry a lot more weight. what you have to have is the science folks in your state explain, do some work so that people can understand, yes, we're not just wanting a free payment. We're going to do some different types of practices on some federal land, maybe. Hopefully we can get that done. But if any private land should have every opportunity, just like everything in the Midwest, maybe the practices just should be a little bit different, tailored to the soil types and the climate conditions. And I would think that as Farm Bureau, you know, I know that I interact with National Farm Bureau quite a bit, and I know that y'all have policy on this as a national organization. But you know, in terms of a state farm bureau, I mean, that's something where most of the really good ideas come from producers having thought through different processes. Hopefully that is happening there as well.
This is one of the nicer things I like working with Joe, since I grew up in Texas, around Arlington and Athens, but I went to school at Lubbock. And I can tell you, if you looked at that map, the big blank area was El Paso. That's very much like us. And so when Joe has to work with something with the whole state of Texas, you almost have the whole different topology of the whole U.S. And I guess those people in the Big Bend area knows it's going to be interesting on that. One more question from the Boys Ranch. Could you ask this question on the balancing of additionality? Oh, unmute. There you go. Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to point out again that this issue of early adopters being kind of aced out of the discussion or any potential for it is just a, you know, I would hope that at the state level and at the federal level that those conversations happen earlier than later. Because it seems like an unfair disadvantage to have been an early adopter. And you spoke to this a bit. And it's not an unusual problem within any of these systems, but there needs to be some sort of fairness worked in. And again, perhaps it's a different model of who the buyer is and what they're buying. And I'm just really curious if much discussion is taking place about that.
I honestly think that from a national policy standpoint, that issue is why we haven't seen more movement forward, because it is slowed everything down. When you start worrying about fairness to early adopters, if it wasn't for them, I think we would have a lot more output from Washington on this, on climate change and carbon in specific. I think that they're trying to figure out a way that makes sense, but the you know, on the other side of the coin, as you mentioned, if I'm Delta Airlines or whatever airline and I'm buying these credits, and most every company in the United States has announced some sort of measure, goal. What would be worse, not doing it at all, or doing it and finding out you really didn't have those credits that you thought you did because there wasn't? I mean, they have to be able to verify everything. And like I said early on, there is still disagreement among soil scientists of exactly how to test this to see what's in the soil. 3 feet is what I was told you have to go down to really measure soil carbon. And there's different ways to do it.
Interesting. Michael, yeah, I see Michael Taylor's in our department. You got a question?
Yeah, Dr. Outlaw. Oh, great talk. So thanks for making time for us. Yeah, I mean, my question is about standards for measuring soil carbon. So I guess I like kind of two questions related to that. Like the first is, why why is it necessary that the federal government set a standard in your view? Like, if there was a standard that was agreed upon by the project developers and verifiers, couldn't that have the same stabilizing effect in terms of as a government standard, I guess? And the second question I have is, like, I'm not working on this stuff directly, but I mean, working in a conversation with some people in the College of Ag who are measuring soil carbon in, I guess, in range systems and in meadow systems, kind of alpine meadow systems. And apparently, like, there's big variability in the amount of carbon you could sequester, and that seems to be an issue. And could you talk about that maybe in the context of these, kind of more kind of Midwest commodity crops, and what challenges that poses?
Yeah, no, you bring up two really good points. The first one is why do we need the government to do this? And maybe we don't need the government to do this, but you sure would, as a producer, who's somebody who's going to have spent a lot less time worrying about that than anybody on this Zoom. As a producer who comes in and wants to sign up, the chances of them getting taken advantage of is 10 times more if there isn't some sort of national standard. I think I don't know. I fully believe that. You could try to convince me otherwise, but I think so. With regard to measuring soil carbon and difference and variability, the funny thing about all of this is that even in the Midwest, no-till generally doesn't get you a ton of carbon, as according to soil scientists. So when you start talking about a $20 rate per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, or whatever it is, you've got a fraction. In Texas, the fraction's 0.2 times whatever that rate is. In the Midwest, that fraction can be 0.8, can be 0.9, but it's a fraction. What I find is strange is what I said early on was the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change has received the Nobel Prize in 2007. And they've been working on this almost continuously this entire time. Why don't they have a standard? I mean, this is supposed to be the top scientists in the world on this issue. Why don't they have a standard? So that we don't have to think about that. So that the standard is not what test, how are we going to measure? It is, we're going to use this test and we're going to get on with it. It just strikes me as strange that they don't have that kind of agreement across the experts. So it tells me it's really hard, or it's really hard to measure, one or the other.
Doug, I see you got another question, Doug Busselman.
Well, first of all, I guess to follow up on that discussion, in most of the conversations that I've been around, a lot of the emphasis is on not necessarily identifying what the results of the practice are. Most of the conversations that I've been around have been focused on identifying what the practice is, and that gives them the ability to use the NRCS guidelines as being, and so you get paid for the practice, not necessarily for the baby in the end.
Right.
And I think another concern, you make mention of a couple of times about how if an airline wants to buy carbon credit and all of that, and that's one scenario. Having spent some time in the Midwest and dealt with some of the major agribusiness entities there, more concerning to me are those cooperatives and grain buyers and those kinds of folks who they want to be politically correct and want to use their ability, Cargill and those kind of folks, to basically push the envelope to the place where they say, we're not going to buy any oats or grains or anything that doesn't meet these expectations. And I think that, and we don't have quite those kinds of problems here in Nevada agriculture, but I mean, I remember dealing when I was with the Minnesota Farm Bureau, and they General Mills announced that they were only going to buy acceptable grain for Cheerios, and I mean, we went apoplectic over just the way that, you know, supposedly our business partners were screwing us over by taking that approach of who can become the more politically correct in any of this.
You're 100% accurate in that. And I'd love to be able to tell you more about what we've been requested to do by Congress, but it's so close to what you just said, I can't really say anymore. But believe me, other people are taking notice of, could this be a good thing, or where could this bite us? And you laid it out pretty well, very well.
Well, part of the problem is that I'm not a true believer in the whole concept of needing to do anything. So consequently, I guess I probably am more conspiracy oriented than I ought to be. But again, I think a lot of this is, you know, trying to pretend that a board stretcher is going to work at getting, you know, a longer board. And if you can make enough people believe that, you can get away with almost anything. And unfortunately, we've got that problem at the state level as well as the federal level.
You know, that's one of the things that I usually say early on is that I don't do that kind of science. I do the easy stuff where you can count money and things like that. And I'm taking it on everyone's word that all this is working, and it is what it is. What I can say, and I'm very adamant about this, is if we're going to have what appears to be a national effort to do things, it has to be fair across every producer in every state. Has to have some ability to participate if they want to. And while I have a lot of skeptical things that I could say, it doesn't do any good for somebody with a spotlight to get up and bring this down when there will be producers that work in this voluntary process. They work through it, they sign up, they get paid for doing things that they wanted to do anyway, probably. But I don't want to be the one that ruins it for them. But at the same time, as I've said twice now, if somebody in Nevada wants to participate, you should get your science folks together and figure out a way to get them so they can participate.
Joe, any other questions from anybody? People raising hands. I saw we have some of our ag extension people. Anybody like to ask a question? Go right ahead. Or
I would.
Bill Payne's Joe. This is our Dean of Agriculture, Bill Payne.
I thought you were the dean. You're not the dean?
He's the dean. No, I'm the dean. I'm the dummy. But you're right. Bill worked a little bit in Amarillo, didn't you, Bill, at the station?
Well, in a College Station, I do have my PhD in soil science.
I recognized the name on the screen before I saw the picture.
Yeah, good to see you, Joe. Apologies, I joined a little bit late. I had another meeting. But it sounds like you've been focusing on carbon and all the vagaries around measuring it, and this is something I've spent a fair amount of my career doing in various dry parts of the world. It's interesting you mentioned 3 feet depth. I can Ratan Lal, a good friend of mine, a soil scientist, who's made some spectacular claims about how much carbon we could fix. Doesn't mention the carbon to nitrogen ratios needed and how much nitrogen you have to add. And he won't oftentimes bring up the studies that show that if you plow, you're sequestering carbon to 6 to 8 feet. And so when you're measuring only that top 6 inches, you're missing all that carbon that's been fixed. But an even messier topic that I've been thrown into as of late, because there's this movement to have this international year of range and pastoralists for United Nations, is ecosystem services. And people try to make the point that, yes, you can only fix so much carbon, and what the point of saturation is something also that's widely debated. But there's this much, much messier problem still of ecosystem services that I wouldn't be surprised for, the reasons you've been touching on for carbon sequestration, we go to also. Well-meaning, virtue signaling, if you will, politically correct people who don't understand the science at all can still be persuaded by certain groups that you've got these trillions of dollars of ecosystem services. And now you're trying to evaluate things like cultural value and things like that. Do you have any perspective on that?
Yeah, I think that when the president came out and basically said we're going to have a carbon bank and we're going to do climate smart practices, my ears pricked up and all the ag groups' ears pricked up, but everybody who thought that they could advance their pet projects ears perked up even better. And so as since you didn't get on at the beginning, I make some bold statements that soil health was kind of the buzzwords that were carried on for quite some time in the last 10 to 15 years, and they've run their course. And now regenerative ag is the same thing, but it's better.
Oh yeah.
And so absolutely, I think people that in their mind, what they have is that they're selling ecosystem services, and this is really, they're just trying to figure out where they fit. And I think that the regenerative ag folks latched on to climate smart practices. Since nobody defined what the practices were, they said, well, let us help you with that. And that's kind of where we're at right now. And I think that the folks in Washington clearly, you don't make the big splash that they made and then just lull for the rest of the year like they have done. So something's going on.
Yeah. And
I think they're trying to work through the issues of additionality. They're trying to work through exactly what are we going to pay for, and what are we going to pay for as USDA, and what are we, as an example, I haven't said this yet, but I have heard a number of people say, why don't we to solve the problem of additionality, why don't we pay those folks with EQIP or CSP funds and let the carbon market be new carbon sequestered? I heard that a couple of months ago, and to me, that moves one of their problems with additionality off to the side, and let's let that be handled with current programs, and lets the new voluntary carbon market, with folks wanting to pay for this, pay for what they really want to pay for, which is new practices. That hasn't gone anywhere lately. I don't know what's going on. I had said not too long ago that I thought all this was going to be resolved by the end of the summer, because I cannot imagine with an election year, not this fall, but next fall, that if they don't make more strides in getting something done, they will have announced this and nothing will happen. Because I can't see them getting any legislation of any consequence through next year on this topic before that election.
To what extent is all of this carbon and ecosystem services tied to the whole 30-30 plan?
Yeah,
I think I think they have tried to distance the two. The 30-30 deal has been kind of a disaster for them, because folks figured out how much land that really was and who was going to be, the government was basically going to be not necessarily buying it, but telling you what you could do with it, which was effectively changing its value. So that was a complete and utter failure rollout as I've ever seen.
Thanks.
Any other, Bill? Thank you. I see there's a couple of people here from our financial ag finance. Have you seen anything, Joe, about how they maybe our ag I'm ag creds, how old I am. How they may have some changes in our farm credit system with people incorporating this practice, these carbon Or is that any?
At this point, not really. You know, you have people that the money isn't going to be big enough to change very much.
Yeah.
In fact, it's going to be kind of most of the producers that want to do this are going to figure out that these practices were what they wanted to do to begin with,
Mhm.
and the money's a secondary nicety, because I don't know if you've seen. I've talked to a number of producers that sat down with some of these companies that I highlighted earlier, and the amount of paperwork that they're going to be
Yes.
required for this $10 to $12, $15 to $20 an acre is enormous. And most of them are going to, and every one of them that I've dealt with so far has thumbed their nose at that, saying $20 is not enough for the amount of loss of privacy that I'm going to have on my operation. Not going to do it, and the amount of record keeping. And so you know, unless something changes there, I think we're going to have the folks who say, you know what, I've always wanted to go no-till. I'm going to try it, and I'll get this benefit as I'm trying it.
Yeah. Well, also, I guess also that they can come anytime to measure your, I can see a farmer watching the A&M Alabama game, not like really liking that. But anyway, any other questions from anybody else?
I have a question.
Okay. Go right ahead.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Joe. How are you?
I'm well.
I would like, I live on 13 acres now. I was raised on 360 acres, a dairy farm with alfalfa and corn, et cetera, during the 50s and 60s. And then I lived on an extremely large ranch in Elko County. And we put up natural fields of grasses, and we watered out of a stream that fed the river. We lived on the North Fork of the Humboldt. So I've had two different sides of how Nevada functions. And I live in the Newlands projects, which is Fallon, Nevada, and we have canal-fed irrigation systems, which I feel there's a lot of water that's wasted, and we could have a different system if we were allowed to create some water banks to be able to facilitate a use less, lease the rest program. And I've just gotten into a situation which is real, and I learned by doing, is that our 10 acres of alfalfa was done. It was a mess. And we were incentivized by putting TEF in by a company here in Fallon, Nevada, that came in and will pay us at the end of the season for the TEF that they have just drilled, and they drilled in a no-till system. So they came in and messed everything, sprayed, messed everything up, came in, cultivated, and seeded within the top 6 inches. And we're getting ready to irrigate, and we'll roll a real slow irrigation over it, water over it. And in the matter of conversation, the conversation with my spouse was, I thought they would come in and rip this up because we have such a older field that hasn't been ripped for at least 7 or 8 years. And I said, well, that's what they're saying we should not do, is disturb the layers of ground that we're on, and all the nutrients are in the top 10 inches of our field. And we don't want to roll it over and mess it up. And so that's a conversation from lay people, from the ground up, is that a no-till process? Can I say that is a no-till program? And so I think the conversation from the rancher farmer basic in the ground is that the definition of no-till is what? The definition is, no, we don't turn that ground over like that anymore. And these are all the reasons why. Now, a larger, more productive, very economically sound farm would know all this, but we're little guys. But little guys make up a lot of little spots all over Nevada. So my question to you, how do we teach the little guys? And that's what Doug was asking. How do we get to that point where we teach the little guys what creating permaculture and creating permaculture is all about? Thank you.
No, I can't. I can tell you how we would do it here. I can't tell you, I don't know the infrastructure that's in place in Nevada, but here we would be using field days and things like that to teach folks. So in fact, after I leave here to finish this, I'm driving to a field day where, you know, it's a meeting where producers drive from place to place and look at different practices that are put in place on different farms, and they assess whether something's going to work for them or not. And so typically that's the model that we use in agriculture and in the education side is field days, publications, things like that. But to me, word of mouth, if you were to want to sign up for carbon credits, and if the person you sign, the company you pick, they come out and they say, you know what, it was alfalfa, it hasn't been tilled since, as I told you before, most companies use in 2012 as kind of the, if you put it in no-till in 2014, we can still sign you up as new. If it was before, if you went into no-till before 2012, then we don't have a spot for you. Those are the types of things. Again, it's a few acres, it's not going to be a big payment, but absolutely, this is where I, as an extension person, this was my normal job is doing outreach. I get paid to do work for Congress because that's what we do here. But I do a lot of outreach, and the normal process is to work through our, you know, the field days, the agents, publications like that. And I don't know how it works in Nevada. Every state's kind of structured differently now, so I really can't say.
Good. Go ahead, Bill.
I would say, and I think that's Brad Schultz's son, so he might want to, who's with Extension, he might want to, and Steve Foster too, who are on, they might want to jump in. We don't have the widespread system of field days that they do in Texas. We don't have the 13 or 14 research and experiment stations across the state. I'm trying to get to the point where we have 2 or 3, whereas when I got here, we didn't have any. But the extension educators, as they call them here, are very active in outreach, whether it's through meetings, fact sheets, etc. And I think it's important also to mention that not all agencies are on the same page when it comes to no-till. I can remember USDA ARS when I was in Eastern Oregon making these spectacular claims about all the benefits of no-till. And your comments on early adopters are interesting because there are a number of people who would claim that they went broke by early adopting because you need a different machinery and more power and all that sort of thing to go to no-till. And right now we have NRCS, and they were using the term soil quality before soil health, you might recall, and then you can go back 100 years ago when they were using the term soil health. They're making spectacular claims about cover crops in dry areas, and a lot of that isn't researched in dry areas. And so you do have, I would say, small producers are getting conflicting messages. I've done a lot of research on no-till, and I would say if you have a plow layer, you need to rip it before you put it into no-till, or you're going to have real problems. Or go to a certain crop like a brassica that's able to pierce that plow layer. Anyway.
Yeah. Would Brad or Steve like to make a comment or anything?
Yeah, I can say, especially in our area, you know, we're limited water. So the farmers here use about all the water they can to grow the crops. But in defense of that, I was on a webinar not too long ago about cover crops and this and that. And I brought up our situation here and explained that even when we don't have cover crops, you know, 90% of the time it's in alfalfa, and then the rotation is usually a winter wheat. So there's something over that soil that acts kind of like a cover crop. It's not as diverse as probably what the true soil health people would like to see. But I brought that question up to these cover crop experts, and their reply was, you know, some places cover crops just don't work. And that's kind of, I think, the situation we're in here. We've got cover over our ground 99% of the time, I think. But to meet the standards that they want for cover crops, we're probably not going to be able to do that, because a lot of these guys, when they get, unlike this year, we won't even get 3 acre feet. They don't like to waste that water on something, then they're ever going to work it back into the ground and not get any money back out of it. So those are some situations that are unique, I think, to Nevada.
Sure. Brad, anything you'd like to add, or?
You know, just, we don't have a lot of annual cropping systems here. So there's just not a lot of bare ground most years. When they grow potatoes, that's an annual crop. It's at most 2 years in a row, but you're not done harvesting until October, and you can't get anything to grow between early to mid-October and early to mid-November when the ground freezes up. So it's, you know, there's just a lot of these practices that just don't work well in this environment and our systems, unless somehow we can change the entire agricultural system, which doesn't seem very practical or likely at this point in time.
Well, as we always seen, I know I always talk about Joe there in Texas. You go from East Texas to El Paso, you got tremendously different planting. Well, the whole thing is just different. Agriculture is different in the whole system. And you're right. I guess what we fear is one national standard, not a standard that looks at differential areas. I see one more question from the Boys Ranch, and then we'll close it here. Did you have one extra question?
Yeah, this is Robin again. And I just wanted to thank you for inviting me. It's been a really valuable discussion for me. I know we'll be having another producer meeting with this ESMC group. And I did have one question going back to the whole market thing. And that is, I guess two, that going through these meetings over the last year and a half with this other group, it seems like regional programs maybe make more sense, or just subject area of you know, soybean, corn, rangelands, that sort of thing, and developing something for each of those. But the other thing, question, I guess, is it seems like the supply chain issue for the big, you know, the Cargills, the Cortivas, the General Mills, and their verification and auditing process for that supply chain is as complex and as much of an issue as the carbon testing costs, all of that. Would you, I mean, are the big companies doing their part in helping solve these issues, and or is that totally inaccurate?
From my standpoint, when I say big companies, corporations, the ones that are paying for the offset credits, I think they're largely uninvolved in this part of the process. If you want to call Cortiva, Dow, Bayer, whoever, big companies, then they are intimately involved in trying to become more involved. And I would ask you, as an economist, we tend to follow the money, and my question is, why are so many companies willing to get into this space to try to be the middle person if they're not making a lot of money at it? And so maybe they're doing it because for good philanthropic reasons, but I generally don't buy that when I'm dealing with folks. So I think that there has to be some. I never say this, but I think there has to be some regulation, whether it's state level, federal level, that basically makes everybody understand what they're getting when they're doing this stuff. And the last thing I would say, and I didn't say this probably very clearly, but it is strange to me that we're worrying so much about carbon sequestration when nitrous oxide is the biggest problem in agriculture. And I haven't heard anybody in Washington address that issue, meaning that carbon was supposed to be easier because there's already some voluntary markets, and California has a market, and we had the climate exchange in the 80s. I mean, in the 2000s. This was supposed to be easier, and it's just not turning out that way.
Sure. Well, I want to thank Joe for his time. I know you need to go. Where are you going, Joe?
To the coast.
Oh,
So
you going to Corpus?
not that far. Not that far.
Okay. Well, I do appreciate Joe's time. He's a fountain of knowledge, and like I said, that Ag Food Policy Center does some very good work. We work with them a lot here, and get information not only to the Department of Ag, but also the Bureau of Labor, Bureau of Land Management, and the Forest Service, which are major players here. Also appreciate everybody hanging on. As you see, this is still an ongoing process, and we'll see what happens. And this is going to be recording, and once I have the recording done, I'll get it out for other people to look at. I also will send you Joe's slides, and that he has his email and web address. If you want to look at the what products the Ag Food Policy Center puts out, you can take a look at that also.
I might say, Tom, and this is a shameless plug, but I'll just do one short one. If folks haven't seen our analysis of the elimination stepped up basis or the rejiggering of the estate taxes that we just did, there are two. It was a request out of Washington for us to do that. If you haven't seen that analysis, it's on our webpage, and it shows pretty devastatingly what it would do to agriculture. So
maybe we can do another podcast on that, Joe,
including the ranch in Elko. So
oh yeah, our Elko Ranch, you could. Well, yeah. we may have to do that. May have to set that up, because that's very interesting.
Yep.
No further questions. Stay cool, everybody. It's 100 degrees here.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Dean Payne.
Thank you, Tom.
Oh, you're glad to do it. Let's see here. Hey, Jordan. Hold on to that. Don't, Jordan. Oh, you're on. Yeah. Did you get? I guess you got You're on mute. I'll unmute you.
No, I'm not.
Okay. Did you got hold of Malika, right?
I did. Yep.
Okay.
I copied you on it. We're gonna.
Oh yeah. So
right.
I think it's just they had some maps of cattle, and we had a guy that did a real good job, but doesn't have the expertise. I think they will make them nicer. That's what that amounts to. Ooh, pardon me. So
Well,
I'll be in on Thursday.
happy maps are not fun. Better maps are better.
Happy maps. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.